Welcome to this episode of Michelson Alexander Explains. This time it is the third and last episode of our series on COVID recovery, and it's with Jen Hewett. So Jen Hewett is the Australian Financial Review's National Affairs columnist. She writes on business and politics. She has been working in journalism since the 70s when she began as a cadet. So her career has taken her to a range of publications, from the Sydney Morning Herald to the Australian, and also included stints in Washington, New York and Canberra. She holds a Master of Journalism from Columbia University's Journalism School. For the purpose of today's episode, we want to pick Jen's brains about covering the pandemic, and she has been covering the pandemic since March 2020. So we'll chat to her about how our leaders have responded to this pandemic, how they've communicated during it, and how the media have covered these leaders and their messages. Just a quick note before we jump into our chat with Jen Hewett. This was recorded about a week prior to Gladys Berejiklian resigning as New South Wales Premier. It doesn't change the analysis as part of it, but it does talk about her being Premier in the present tense. Now, Jen Hewett. Jen, thanks for joining us. Before we go a little bit deeper into things, you're an experienced journalist, but when you first heard about COVID-19 and when it first hit the news pages in early 2020, did you expect that you would be spending the best part of 2 years covering this thing?
No, I would never have dreamed of that like anybody else. I think I thought of it as a kind of very strange but very temporary problem. And I certainly had no expectation that it would last as long as it did. Even by last year, I was saying to somebody the other day as I was walking around Melbourne in my mask, yet again, if you'd told me last winter in Melbourne that I'd still be doing that this winter, I would have been so depressed. So it's probably lucky I didn't know.
In those initial stages, I know particularly in March last year, it started to get very chaotic and the media was kind of in this 24-hour cycle. So what was that like, being in a newsroom, as I guess the penny was dropping a little bit that this was something that was going to dictate the rest of the year for us?
Well, I think weirdly, I happen to be in what is absolutely now the hermit kingdom of Western Australia for a couple of weeks leading up to March for my niece's wedding. And as things were kind of closing in and borders were shutting, I was thinking this is getting more and more strange here. And I think I better just get back to the east as soon as I can. What I think was very obvious at the time was that the federal government was being pretty reluctant to move quickly and was very, cautious, incredibly cautious. And I think Brendan Murphy was very cautious as well. Whereas both the premiers of New South Wales and Victoria, as we've seen kind of repeatedly, I think, through the pandemic, we're forcing the issue and leading the way for good or ill, really. And I think that Sunday in late March, where they basically said, look, we're going to close down and you can kind of come along or give your agreement or not, but that's what we're going to do. And I think that has kind of set the pattern, really, for the primacy of the premiers ever since.
Do you see that actually changing for good the way federation works? Pre-COVID, the average person would know who their premier is, but I don't know whether they would really have much knowledge beyond their premier. And now, these people are known by one name. It's Dan, it's Gladys. It's a very different scenario that we are now coming into. Is that going to change the way state and federal politics works in the future, you think?
Well, I think inevitably, look, you've got to be a bit cautious about making hard and fast predictions, really, given the experience of the last 18 months in particular. But I think, yes, there's no doubt that the state political leaders have asserted their authority over the Commonwealth, which was always there, but they kind of didn't really use it. And I think there was this issue that you're quite right, that the people knew their own premier, but they wouldn't have had a clue really about other premiers. That has now changed. I think there's no doubt there's been a splintering of the federation. The other thing I think that's been interesting to note is that of course, the federal government always has the purse strings, and it was able to, in a sense, hold that over the states, cooperate with us or else. But what the pandemic changed was that the enormous popular support for what individual premiers were doing, and the states first as opposed to Australia first mentality that developed meant that federal governments refusing to kind of give states money if they didn't like what they were doing risked a very, very big voter backlash. And that made them particularly nervous. And I think you've seen that particularly with the state of Victoria and also the state of Western Australia.
And we've probably started to go into this a little bit. Obviously, there's been a much bigger spotlight on Gladys Berejiklian and Victorians actually paying attention to what she's doing, and then vice versa with New South Wales, people in New South Wales paying attention to what Dan Andrews is doing. So under that kind of more intense spotlight, have you observed any changes in what's worked for the premiers in particular throughout the pandemic?
Yes, well, I, of course, was in the rather odd position of having sharing my time really between Sydney and Melbourne. So I kind of went when I could between both cities, including having to do 2 weeks quarantine to return to Sydney a year ago, last September. And at the time, I said that I felt that nobody in Melbourne understood what life in Sydney was like, how free it was, and nobody in Sydney really understood how incredibly closed down Melbourne was and how difficult it had been and was being through lockdown. So since then, of course, so Gladys Berejiklian naturally we got a lot of kudos, I think, particularly in New South Wales, even though the Victorians got very shirty about, the comparison all the time, in saying, look, we've managed COVID. We do it very well. We've got the answer, really. And so that worked, I think, even though Dan Andrews was extremely popular in Victoria. I don't doubt that. But New South Wales would say, look, we've got a different approach, and this is actually much more efficient for the economy and actually for the results. So then you come to 2021 and you had that same kind of hubris, I think you'd have to say, about the New South Wales approach, and which was defeated by Delta. And so, in a sense, the position's reversed. And so Daniel Andrews was able to say, oh, well, look, New South Wales doesn't have a clue what it's doing, but we know what we're doing, and we're going to do what's always worked here. Then that went on for a few months. Now, of course, I think we've actually got the reverse going on, where it's very clear that New South Wales is going to be first out of lockdown. Its citizens are again feel that they're leading the way, and the Victoria is basically looking at what New South Wales does, and more slowly and cautiously and kind of reluctantly being forced to follow suit, because Dan Andrews belatedly agreed that there was no way you could actually eliminate the virus in Victoria either.
So is the lesson there that Delta ultimately will make fools of them all?
Well, I think Delta did make fools of us all, really. I wouldn't say it's just the politicians. It certainly hasn't been an easy time for political leaders, even though I, often feel like screaming at the television when I hear various premiers and the Prime Minister speaking. But I think it's the example of predictions. That's what I was saying about you're always nervous about predictions, because so many of these expert predictions have been proven completely wrong, whether it was possible to eliminate the virus, or the other extreme that our hospitals would be completely overrun and there'd be thousands and thousands of cases by today.
You just mentioned the fact that sometimes you sit and scream at the TV when you hear these leaders speaking. And as a communications firm, I suppose we're very interested in the message and how things are communicated. What do you think different leaders have done well, and what have they not done well during this time?
It depends, of course, on their audience. So, for example, if you're in Western Australia and you're listening to Mark McGowan, not all of the population, but an overwhelming majority of the population say, well, that's great. Yes, he's keeping us safe, and we think that's absolutely marvellous. Whereas if you're in the East, you roll your eyes and think, oh my, really and truly, how absurd is that position? And the idea that you're going to be able to keep your borders closed forever. Similarly, Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland, I think, speaks quite well to the Queensland audience, but irritates everybody, not least of whom being the New South Wales Premier, with her approach, which often appears, I think, incredibly heartless and just unreasonable to anybody outside the state. Then you look at New South Wales. I think Gladys, I think, in a sense, I think she's got a default position as we will do everything we can to make our citizens as free as we can. That's her default position, kind of yes, but. Whereas I think Dan Andrews is no, but. That's his default position. And I think, in a sense, both those views and approaches probably suit the character of their states a little more than we realised, and how essentially kind of different they were. I remember being completely attacked. I think last year I said that Victorians seem to have a touch of Stockholm syndrome when it came to lockdown, and there was just absolute outrage about how dare I say that, and people saying, well, clearly I just didn't understand Victorians. And I thought, well, that's possibly true. I'm from Western Australia originally, have lived in New South Wales for most of my life. So I do think it depends on the audience. And then, but you've seen very dogmatic approaches really by both the New South Wales Premier and the Victorian Premier. In contrast, I think you look at the Tasmanian Premier, the South Australian Premier, and the Northern Territory Chief Minister, rather unusually, I think, for the Northern Territory, really, in terms of their national or state characteristics. They've been much more subdued in the sense they haven't tried to say, oh, look, we know best and those other states are hopeless.
You've raised a couple of interesting points there, but from what you're saying, the biggest thing for all of those leaders is to understand their constituents and speak to the people that ultimately have a say in whether they get re-elected. And that seems to have been the strategy and what they've focused on.
Yes. I think, for example, in Victoria, the I Stand With Dan crowd is certainly not as strong as it was before, but he is, and Victoria, as we all now know, is coming up to a most unfortunate world record of being the city in the gold standard, the world record holder for the city in the longest lockdown, coming up early next month, beating Buenos Aires of all places. So I think that is a difficult position. On the other hand, and I think it's become definitely more unpopular than it was, because the lockdown is so slow and people, again, can look at New South Wales. But he still maintains a lot of support because he has that I think an excellent ability to be able to speak to people in plain and direct language. I think that serves him well with a majority of the population still. However, a minority of the population and a growing minority of the population find it, even more irritating than they did last year. With Gladys Berejiklian, she's much less dogmatic, I think, in how she talks about things, a little bit more circuitous in her press conferences even though she doesn't take every single last question. But I think she speaks again to, look, we're doing what we can. This is very difficult. And she always remains pretty relentlessly positive and tends not to lecture people quite as much as Dan Andrews does.
On that thread, you mentioned press conferences, which has been an issue in recent times. If we go back to last year, there was this notion of that Dan was fronting up every day and that he, even I think there was a social media post that sort of said 100 straight press conferences, which I think got pulled pretty quickly. But recently there was a lot of controversy over the fact that Gladys was not going to do a daily press conference. Do you think the daily press conference has the importance that maybe we placed on it initially, or is that a little bit overblown, you think, in the whole scheme of things?
Oh, I think it's a bit overblown. I think in New South Wales, I was really struck by how many people said that they'd, used to tune in every day and, kind of watch it breathlessly. But as the months wore on, it became less of a must-listen to, must-see event. People listened for the numbers. So, I think Gladys Berejiklian was right in the sense to say that we had to concentrate on the number of hospitalisations rather than the number of cases every day, and it didn't require her to be there every day. But she did it in a very clumsy way, and that made everybody, highly agitated, and there were calls about it, particularly as she was saying, these next, September and October is going to be the peak for hospitalisations. Well, she didn't actually admit she was rowing back from that, but she has very much so, and has regularly continued to not every day to front the press conference. But I think it's reasonable that she doesn't do it every day. Similarly, I think Daniel Andrews doesn't do it every day. He didn't make such a big song and dance about it. For example, he didn't on the day of the last Monday with the big march going on, or was it last Tuesday? Sorry, the big march going on in Melbourne. He didn't front, and there was an immediate criticism of that. And he was out there very early the next morning to give his views.
And so we've spoken before on this show about the expectations of leaders changing. We've spoken about press conferences there, which almost kind of fit into this wartime governance kind of idea. And we also spoke about, Scott Morrison's Father's Day trip, which got a lot of criticism in the media when he flew out of Canberra to Sydney to visit his family. Are we expecting our leaders now to really stand up with a stiff upper lip every day and not perhaps show those kind of family values that in the past might have been good political capital?
Look, there's a bit of hypocrisy around there. In fact, I think the optics, as they say, were bad for Scott Morrison, particularly amongst those people who don't like him, and there's a lot of those. But in fact, he perfectly, there was a lot of hypocrisy there. He did obey the rules in terms of being able to go back to Sydney to visit his family on Father's Day. He was permitted to go back to Canberra as an essential worker. Other people, including other Labor politicians, had used many of the same reasons, but because it was so he also tried to use a different photograph of himself, an old photograph of himself rather than where he was actually on Father's Day. So I think that did not help. And it meant that it kind of contributed to this idea that at the wrong time, he's missing in action. But do I think in more generally that people paid that much attention and that it will last? Probably not. It was more that it compounded a view that he sometimes he didn't follow the same rules as he expected other people to. That was not entirely fair, but it certainly kind of contributed to that idea if people wanted to have it.
And I know it's hard to do, I suppose, self-analysis at this time, but how have you seen the media as a whole in covering the whole pandemic? I'm sure it's tiring for one, but do you think that they have shaped it, or has it been a sort of faithful reporting of what is going on? Some people out there believe that, the media have played a role in shaping our perception of things. Well, how do you see the media's role over the last 2 years?
Like, in a sense, it's very easy to overstate the role of the media and say it's all the media's fault, or if they didn't do this wouldn't happen, etc. On the other hand, it's also easy to understate it, and then I think you have to look at the media in two ways. You have to look at the importance of social media these days, which I think has absolutely transformed things, certainly for a sizable proportion of the population, and that has had a kind of symbiotic affair. Sometimes I think unreasonably, for example, traditional media pay far too much attention to what's on Twitter or what's trending on Twitter, which is really only a small thing, but it does kind of get amplified, and I think that does have a huge effect. And then when you have people who are people are under a lot of pressure, clearly, and you saw in the press conferences, frankly, I don't think the Melbourne-based media did a particularly good job of interrogating Dan Andrews last year about, the obvious problems in hotel quarantine, who was culpable, all of those issues. I think actually his ability to manipulate the media was on full display, and it worked extremely well for him. Then you saw this year with Gladys Berejiklian, she again got a pretty, not an easy ride, but she was certainly not having to ask, because she could say, look, New South Wales, things have gone very well. That completely changed when numbers got out of control with this Delta virus, and she was being really accosted every day, quite aggressively, about her failures to do more, to lock down more, to in fact be more like Dan Andrews, and she had to withstand that. But I think the media, it does set a tone, and what's covered does set a tone, and of course people in the media have to remember, which we often don't, that that people don't follow every single in and out, like a journalist covering it every day does, and they get, most of their impressions on a couple of seconds of the daily news. So what is chosen to be emphasised there, it can't be in total contradiction to what people's everyday experience is or what their own sentiments is, but it certainly does influence the general kind of mood and debate, I think.
And when we speak a little bit, obviously, about Delta in particular and how that's changed the game and obviously changed our economic trajectory. So is there any cause for optimism when it comes to the economy, or is that a question that really ultimately depends on who you ask? I think there's a few people who do find that optimism, but then there's a lot of others who find a lot of reason for pessimism.
Yes, that's right. Well, people were very pessimistic last year, including the government, including Treasury, including the Reserve Bank, about how quickly the economy could possibly come back from this, terrible blow that had occurred, and and instead it came roaring back, and it was a remarkable achievement. Then and so we went into the beginning of 2021, everybody feeling incredibly optimistic, falling unemployment, helped, of course, I must say, by lowering immigration. But all the strains that were in the economy were covered up really by the amount of government money and private money that was available, and the fact that the Australian economy had managed to stay open mostly and then kind of come back. And, of course, there was the fabulous cushion of a iron ore boom that was actually protecting a lot of that budget respending. It was really, that was very helpful, even if people didn't kind of quite recognise it. It allowed, for example, the Western Australian government to be one of the only countries in the world to post a budget surplus, but it also certainly helped the federal government as well. This year, I think, is quite different, and I suspect, maybe I'm being too pessimistic, I suspect we are underestimating now the pain that's been caused to the economy in New South Wales and Victoria, particularly amongst small and medium enterprises who have to keep coming back, and with their financial resilience, their emotional resilience, if anything, just so already battered by the events of the previous year, and then to kind of keep them coming is very, very hard. At the same time, you've had a collapse, and not a collapse, it's certainly not quite as low as it's been in recent years, in some at record lows, but it's still come down an awful lot, the iron ore price. That makes a big difference. So I think the impact of these shutdowns, these protracted shutdowns in New South Wales and Victoria will last longer than we gave it, than we expect possibly, and it will not be the kind of really quick big bounce back that we saw in 2020. One
of the issues that surrounds that economic recovery was JobKeeper, and the fact that a number of generally large companies that took JobKeeper and took JobKeeper payments then ended up recording profits. I suppose the simple answer that a lot of people have is that these companies should be paying back those JobKeeper funds. Is it as simple as that, or is there more nuance to this?
Well, things are never quite as simple as that, of course. And there was obviously a great desire to get money out as quickly as possible. And in that sense, it did have a great effect. And that meant just going on what businesses were expecting. Now, in doing so, they clearly didn't put in the right clawback provisions when businesses went well. The argument against that is to say, look, we were trying to just build up confidence, and so if people thought that they might have to pay it back, well, then that wouldn't have worked so well either. They wouldn't have kept their staff on to the same degree. I think that's kind of overstated. I think now there's look, by and large, it was still an incredibly effective program, and many of the companies that should have paid back money saw their revenues increase rather than decrease, or at least stay reasonably high, were small and medium-sized companies. But naturally, all of the attention has gone to the bigger companies, the most famous, of course, probably being Harvey Norman or Premier Investments. I think it's been interesting. The ones who have chosen to pay at least some of it back have done so in response to community pressure. I think it's been I think it's been very bad, though, for the reputation of business in general, because the overall impression, forget the nuances, have meant that it just gave people an excuse again to say, oh, all of that stuff about we care about our customers, we care about our community, we're not just now for shareholders, we're for all these, just in general community. It brought a bad taste back about that. So the companies, the high-profile companies that didn't pay it back, many of them often, like, for example, Harvey Norman, associated with a particular, strong founder or individual, I think did a lot of reputational damage to business, and they should not be thanked for that. It's also made it slightly more difficult for the federal government and Josh Frydenberg to continue to insist that JobKeeper was the success that it actually was.
And of course, the other major news item in the last fortnight was this AUKUS treaty, or this new AUKUS agreement with these nuclear-powered submarines, which obviously does something to escalate tensions in the region. So does that pose any threat to our recovery prospects from an economic sense?
No, I don't think it poses any threat really from an economic sense, only in a modest way. Well, it's not modest if you're living in South Australia and you're one of the businesses who've been investing in the idea of you're going to go with the French group, and you've got these all these prospects and invested on that basis. That is a very, very big deal, and because no matter what happens, the government says, oh no, there'll be all this demand, but actually what's going to happen is a big pause for 18 months at least, probably longer, while they figure out exactly how this will work. So that is a very big deal for them. But in general, no, I do not think so. I think all the threats to the idea of the European Free Trade Agreement, yes, they're real, but it was always going to be very, very hard and a very protracted process to get a deal with the Europeans. Anyway, that's not just Australia. That's how it happens. Whoever tries to negotiate with the European Union. I think there's all sorts of other issues about the AUKUS deal, but I don't think the economic impact per se is that much.
And look, one last question, Jen, and we talked about before the fact that this pandemic has made both politicians and journalists look a little bit stupid when they try to tell us what was going to happen in the future. But I'm going to ask that question. So tell me, we've sort of been drilled in with this orthodoxy that at times of threat or danger that incumbency helps a government, and it seems to have done that over the last 12 months or so. Things might be changing a little bit. What do you see in the short term for governments, both federal and state, around the country? How is this going to affect their grip on power in the next little while?
Well, incumbency certainly helps a government in a period of great peril if they are seen to deliver. And that is why the vaccine rollout and the delays and the problems that have been have been so damaging to the Morrison government's prospects. Now, the federal government is still hoping that, by Christmas, enough of that will be on track and forgiven, and that by March, probably they'll be able to focus on other things and say, look, here we are, the bright future. But at the moment, I think it's a very perilous time, and particularly people stuck in lockdown, they blame their state governments a bit, but of course the state governments then blame the federal government, and that is for a government which is in such a knife edge. It's not as though they've got a lot of seats to burn. That's a very kind of perilous position to be in. I think also the federal government was hoping to pick up seats, particularly in Western Sydney. I think that's going to be a much bigger ask now than it was. They're still looking okay in Queensland. They're not looking good in Western Australia. So I do think incumbency, yes, can help, but only if everybody thinks you've done a good job. So the federal government, its particular focus will be on trying to change the narrative to look what, we've got the economy starting up again, everything's opening up, we're doing well, and our security, our national security, they've obviously ramped that up as well. That always plays reasonably well for the coalition. We are going to have a much brighter future. So we'll see how that plays. For state governments, I think it's more mixed, but you'd probably, want to say that most of them definitely benefited from incumbency.
Jen Hewett, I think that's a really good place to finish. Thanks so much for joining us on the show. It's been really great for the firm and great to pick your brains after what has been a chaotic 18 months for everyone, you included.
Terrific. Great pleasure.
And for our listeners, we will be back in a couple of weeks with a What's at Stake episode for October. This episode is the last in our little mini-series on COVID recovery. So if you haven't listened to the first two, you can find them in the back catalogue. Thanks for joining us.